Luke had always been a quiet presence at Eastwood High School. To most, he was invisible, a regular guy who blended into the background, neither the popular jock nor the overachieving student who demanded attention. His life was predictable, even boring at times, but he was content. He wasn't interested in fitting into the mold that his classmates followed. In fact, it often seemed as though they were all chasing something he couldn't even define. The group of wealthy students who dominated the school's social scene, like Olivia Hartman, were a world apart. Olivia was the quintessential rich girl. Tall, blonde, and always impeccably dressed, she was the star of Eastwood. Her father, a powerful real estate mogul, had more money than any of them could fathom. She'd walk into class like she owned the place, her designer clothes drawing the eyes of everyone, while Luke would sit at the back of the room, his old sneakers and faded hoodie barely noticeable. Olivia's family could afford the latest tech gadgets, the trendiest clothes, and vacations to exotic places. It was a lifestyle Luke could only dream about, but he never really allowed himself to dwell on it. His focus was on getting through high school without drama, on keeping his head down, finishing his assignments, and hoping no one noticed the gaps between his life and theirs. That morning, Luke didn't think it would be any different from any other. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a faint golden light through the window as he sat down in his room, eating a quick breakfast. He checked his phone, an old model that was starting to show its age. The screen flickered occasionally, and the battery barely lasted through the day. But it was his, and he made do with what he had. It wasn't the latest iPhone like everyone else had, but it served its purpose. At school, the usual hustle and bustle filled the halls. The lockers rattled as students shoved their textbooks inside. The bell rang to signal the start of the day, and voices filled the air with the chatter of teenage life. Luke moved through the crowd like a shadow, unnoticed, content with his place. But then he walked into homeroom. Olivia Hartman was already there, sitting near the front of the classroom. She was typing away on her sleek, brand-new iPhone, the silver casing gleaming in the morning light. Her friends, who always seemed to surround her, laughed and whispered, sharing the latest gossip about the weekend party they'd attended. Luke sat down in his usual spot near the back, pulling out his worn-out phone and turning it off to conserve the battery. He couldn't help but glance at Olivia's phone, the difference so stark between theirs. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed, but this time it stung more than usual. The shiny new device in Olivia's hand seemed to mock him. As the bell rang to signal the start of class, the teacher, Mr. Donovan, shuffled to the front of the room and began to take attendance. Olivia leaned back in her chair, not paying attention, her gaze fixed on her phone screen. Luke tried to focus on the lesson, but the thought of his outdated phone kept nagging at him. He didn't know why it bothered him so much, but there was something about the way Olivia handled her wealth, like it was her birthright, that made him feel small. He had learned over the years to ignore it, to just go about his day without letting the wealth gap get under his skin. But today was different. Out of nowhere, Olivia's voice cut through the silence. "Luke, is that seriously your phone?" she asked, her voice dripping with a mix of amusement and condescension. She didn't even look up from her screen, but her friends noticed, turning their attention to him. Luke's face turned red. "Yeah, it's just a phone," he muttered, trying to shrug it off. But the words sounded weak even to him. "You know, if you're going to survive high school, you need something better than that. Everyone's going to think you're, well, let's just say, stuck in the past," Olivia said, finally lifting her eyes to me. He hated the way she could make him feel like nothing. It wasn't the first time either. Olivia had a knack for tearing people down, making them feel inferior without even trying. But today was different. The insult stung more than it ever had before. The others in the room giggled, a few even making comments about how Luke was so. As Luke stepped into the crowded hallway, the weight of Olivia's words still hung heavy in his chest. His mind raced, but he tried to block it out. shoving his feelings aside as he made his way to his next class. The echoes of laughter from Olivia and her friends lingered in his ears, and despite his best efforts to ignore them, it felt as though the entire school had seen him as nothing more than a punching bag. The phone. Olivia's phone. Luke had always been a quiet presence at Eastwood High School. To most, he was invisible, a regular guy who blended into the background. Neither the popular jock nor the overachieving student who demanded attention. His life was predictable, even boring at times, but he was content. He wasn't interested in fitting into the mold that his classmates followed. In fact, it often seemed as though they were all chasing something he couldn't even define. The group of wealthy students who dominated the school's social scene, like Olivia Hartman, were a world apart. Olivia was the quintessential rich girl. Tall, blonde, and always impeccably dressed, she was the star of Eastwood. Her father, a powerful real estate mogul, had more money than any of them could fathom. She'd walk into class like she owned the place, her designer clothes drawing the eyes of everyone, while Luke would sit at the back of the room, his old sneakers and faded hoodie barely noticeable. Olivia's family could afford the latest tech gadgets, the trendiest clothes, and vacations to exotic places. It was a lifestyle Luke could only dream about, but he never really allowed himself to dwell on it. His focus was on getting through high school without drama, on keeping his head down, finishing his assignments, and hoping no one noticed the gaps between his life and theirs. That morning, Luke didn't think it would be any different from any other. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a faint golden light through the window as he sat down in his room, eating a quick breakfast. He checked his phone, an old model that was starting to show its age. The screen flickered occasionally, and the battery barely lasted through the day. But it was his, and he made do with what he had. It wasn't the latest iPhone like everyone else had, but it served its purpose. At school, the usual hustle and bustle filled the halls. The lockers rattled as students shoved their textbooks inside. The bell rang to signal the start of the day, and voices filled the air with the chatter of teenage life. Luke moved through the crowd like a shadow, unnoticed, content with his place. But then he walked into homeroom. Olivia Hartman was already there, sitting near the front of the classroom. She was typing away on her sleek, brand-new iPhone, the silver casing gleaming in the morning light. Her friends, who always seemed to surround her, laughed and whispered, sharing the latest gossip about the weekend party they'd attended. Luke sat down in his usual spot near the back, pulling out his worn-out phone and turning it off to conserve the battery. He couldn't help but glance at Olivia's phone, the difference so stark between theirs. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed, but this time it stung more than usual. The shiny new device in Olivia's hand seemed to mock him. As the bell rang to signal the start of class, the teacher, Mr. Donovan, shuffled to the front of the room and began to take attendance. Olivia leaned back in her chair, not paying attention, her gaze fixed on her phone screen. Luke tried to focus on the lesson, but the thought of his outdated phone kept nagging at him. He didn't know why it bothered him so much, but there was something about the way Olivia handled her wealth, like it was her birthright, that made him feel small. He had learned over the years to ignore it, to just go about his day without letting the wealth gap get under his skin. But today was different. Out of nowhere, Olivia's voice cut through the silence. "Luke, is that seriously your phone?" she asked, her voice dripping with a mix of amusement and condescension. She didn't even look up from her screen, but her friends noticed, turning their attention to him. Luke's face turned red. "Yeah, it's just a phone," he muttered, trying to shrug it off, but the words sounded weak even to him. "You know, if you're going to survive high school, you need something better than that. Everyone's going to think you're, well, let's just say, stuck in the past," Olivia said, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. The slight smirk on her lips made Luke feel like a child. The thought gnawed at him like a splinter he couldn't remove. He knew he shouldn't let it get to him. People like Olivia always had everything, while people like him struggled to keep up. But in that moment, his pride, his frustration, and his sense of injustice grew to a boiling point. By lunch, the day had only gotten worse. Luke sat alone in the cafeteria, poking at his food, but not really eating. The usual hum of conversation surrounded him, but he might as well have been invisible. His mind kept replaying Olivia's mocking tone, the way she casually dismissed him, as if he were insignificant. Luke wasn't used to confrontation, and part of him regretted letting it get to him. But the other part, the part that had been quietly simmering for months, was furious. The truth was, he was tired of being overlooked. Tired of being the guy with the outdated phone, the one with the worn-out shoes while the rest of the school strutted around in designer clothes, flaunting their wealth like it was a badge of honor. Olivia Hartman, with her perfect life and perfect smile, was the embodiment of everything that made Luke feel small. He glanced across the cafeteria, his eyes falling on Olivia, who was sitting with her usual group of friends, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. The irony of it all was that Olivia probably didn't even realize the damage she'd done. She didn't understand what it was like to be in Luke's shoes. The pressure of trying to survive in a world where everyone else had everything handed to them. To Olivia, the theft of an iPhone would be an inconsequential thing, a joke. But to Luke, it felt like the last straw. His phone, with its cracked screen and outdated software, was more than just a device. It was his lifeline, his connection to the world beyond the walls of this school that often felt so suffocating. And now, it was gone. It wasn't until the end of lunch that Luke noticed something strange. As he gathered his things to leave, he saw Olivia walking out of the cafeteria, her eyes scanning the room. For a moment, she locked eyes with him, and then she quickly turned her head, as if trying to avoid looking at him. But it was too late. Luke's heart began to race. She was acting strangely, almost nervously. He had seen that look before, in the way someone behaves when they know they've done something wrong, but think they can get away with it. Suddenly, everything clicked. Luke's stomach tightened, and his thoughts spiraled out of control. He wasn't imagining it. Olivia had taken his phone. There was no other explanation. He had left his seat in the classroom with his phone right there, only for it to be missing the moment he returned. It had to have been her. She had taken it. And now, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She probably thought it was some harmless joke. But to Luke, it was a violation. Determined, he left the cafeteria and began searching for Olivia. The halls were crowded with students, but his eyes scanned each face as he moved through the crowd. He felt a sense of urgency growing inside him. He had to confront her. It wasn't just about the phone anymore. It was about standing up for himself, about showing that he wouldn't let her treat him like this without consequences. He found Olivia near the lockers, chatting with a few of her friends. She didn't seem to notice him approaching, her back turned as she laughed at something one of her friends had said. His pulse quickened, and he took a deep breath before walking up to her. "Olivia," he said, his voice trembling slightly. She turned around, startled by the sudden confrontation. For a moment, she didn't speak, and Luke could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She was caught off guard, but she quickly masked it with her usual confident demeanor. "Luke," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's up? Did you forget to do your homework or something?" Luke's jaw tightened, and he forced himself to remain calm. "I know you took my phone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt like they carried the weight of an entire year of frustration. "I want it back." The smug expression on Olivia's face faltered for a split second. She glanced around at her friends, who had gone silent, and then back at Luke. There was a brief silence before she let out a soft laugh, as if trying to brush the accusation off. "Really? You're accusing me of taking your old phone?" she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Why would I steal something so outdated?" Luke clenched his fists, his anger rising, but he tried to stay composed. "Because I saw you with it earlier," he said, his voice steady. "And now it's gone. You took it." Olivia's eyes narrowed, and she shot a glance at her friends, who were all watching the confrontation unfold. "You're crazy," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "I didn't take your phone. You're just paranoid or something." Luke's frustration reached its peak. He couldn't believe how easily she was denying it. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't imagining things. But there was nothing he could do to prove it. His heart sank as he realized that if he pushed this further, it would only make him look foolish, and Olivia knew it. As Olivia walked away with her friends, Luke stood frozen, his mind spinning with a mix of anger and helplessness. He knew he had to find a way to get his phone back, but he wasn't sure how. The worst part was that Olivia hadn't just taken his phone. She'd taken his dignity too. He felt small, insignificant, like an afterthought in a world where people like Olivia were the ones who called the shots. Luke knew this wasn't just about the phone anymore. It was about more than that. It was about standing up for himself, about showing that he wasn't going to let anyone walk all over him. And deep down, he knew this would be the turning point, the moment when everything changed. But what he didn't know yet was just how far he was willing to go to get his phone back behind the times. Luke's hands clenched into fists, his face burning with frustration. Mr. Donovan's voice broke through the tension. "All right, enough with the distractions, everyone. Focus up." The room quieted, but the damage had already been done. Olivia's words echoed in Luke's head, lingering like a cloud that wouldn't go away. As the class went on, Luke's mind kept returning to the conversation. It wasn't about the phone, he realized. It was about the way Olivia's wealth had become part of her identity. She didn't just have money. She had power, and she wielded it like a weapon. And here he was, with his outdated phone and his faded clothes, feeling like he didn't belong. The bell finally rang, signaling the end of class. Luke grabbed his bag quickly, eager to escape the room, and put the conversation behind him. But as he stood up, something caught his eye. It was Olivia's phone. She had left it on her desk, the sleek silver device just sitting there, unattended. His heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, he considered the possibility. What if he just took it? What if he could show her that he wasn't as insignificant as she thought? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He wasn't like that. He wasn't a thief, but the idea stayed with him, nagging at the back of his mind as he walked out of the classroom and into the hallway. He didn't know it then, but that one small, fleeting moment would change everything. The seed had been planted, his resentment, his frustration, and his growing feeling of being overlooked in a world that had no place for someone like him. Little did he know, that day would set in motion a chain of events that would push him to make decisions he never thought possible. And in the end, nothing would ever be the same. At his. The slight smirk on her lips made Luke feel like a child. The days that followed felt like a blur to Luke. He couldn't concentrate on anything, his mind constantly spinning with thoughts of Olivia and the phone. Every time he looked around school, he saw Olivia and her friends laughing, chatting, or enjoying themselves as if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed for Luke. He was no longer just the quiet kid at the back of the classroom. He was the one who had been robbed, and nobody seemed to care. It gnawed at him, that sense of powerlessness. There was no one to stand up for him. He'd thought about telling a teacher, but he quickly dismissed the idea. Olivia's father had connections. He was a major donor to the school, always showing up at fundraisers and events with that air of superiority that people like him often had. Luke knew that if he went to the authorities, the situation would only get worse. Olivia would deny it, and the school would likely side with her. That's what made Luke's decision so much harder. There was no way to prove what had happened, and nobody would believe him without evidence. He couldn't let it slide. He couldn't just let it go, not after everything that had happened. His pride had been wounded, and there was no way to mend that wound without confronting her directly. But how could he get his phone back? Every time he tried to make sense of it, he found himself coming back to the same question. What was he willing to do to get it back? For the next few days, Luke watched Olivia closely, hoping for a chance to confront her. She was always surrounded by her friends, always moving in groups, always surrounded by that invisible wall of privilege that kept people like him at bay. He realized, as he saw her walk through the hallways with that confident stride, that she never had to face the consequences of her actions. To her, everything was disposable. Her wealth, her friends, even people like Luke. He could see it in the way she casually discarded her phone one day on the lunch table, or in the way she dismissed people when they didn't meet her standards. It wasn't just the phone anymore. It was the way she treated everyone around her, as if they were beneath her. Luke's frustration grew with every passing day. He knew he couldn't confront her directly in front of everyone, not without risking making things even worse for himself. But his need for closure was overwhelming. Then, one afternoon, when he was walking through the halls between classes, he saw it, Olivia's bag. It sat unattended on a bench just outside the restroom, her designer purse hanging from the strap. Luke's heart pounded as his eyes locked on it. He glanced around to make sure no one was looking, his mind racing. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, the chance to get his phone back once and for all. It felt like destiny, like the universe had thrown him a lifeline. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if it wasn't in there? What if he got caught? But his anger, his sense of injustice, overpowered the fear. With a glance over his shoulder to make sure no one was nearby, he moved toward the bag, his hands shaking with anticipation. He unzipped it slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. His fingers brushed against a few items before finally, his hand closed around the familiar weight of his phone. His breath caught in his throat, and he quickly pulled it out, holding it for a moment as if it were some kind of precious artifact. The phone was just as he remembered it, old, battered, and barely functioning. But it was his. It was his right to have it. He was about to put the phone back in his pocket when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Panic surged through him, and his heart skipped a beat. He couldn't get caught. Not now. Not when he was so close. He quickly shoved the phone back into the bag and zipped it up just as Olivia rounded the corner. Her eyes met his, and for a split second, Luke froze. He could see the surprise in her expression as she stopped in her tracks, a brief flash of confusion passing over her face. "What are you doing with my bag?" Olivia's voice was sharp, cutting through the air. Her friends appeared behind her, their eyes narrowing as they assessed the situation. Luke's stomach dropped. He hadn't meant he had caught. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there, frozen, the guilt and fear creeping over him. I wasn't. I was just. Luke stammered, his voice faltering. Olivia's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. And then, without a word, she reached for the bag. Luke stepped back instinctively, but it was too late. Olivia had already grabbed it, pulling it toward her and opening it. For a long moment, there was silence. Luke's chest tightened as he watched her pull out a few books, a pencil case, and finally, his phone. The look on her face shifted, a strange mix of confusion and amusement spreading across her features. She turned the phone over in her hands, inspecting it as if it were some kind of oddity. Well, Olivia said slowly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like someone has a little problem with stealing." She tossed the phone back into her bag, not even bothering to look at him as she turned to leave. Her friends snickered, following her out of the hallway, leaving Luke standing there, crushed. The humiliation hit harder than he expected. He had taken a risk, done something he never thought he would. And now he was the one caught in the act. For the rest of the day, Luke felt the weight of Olivia's gaze on him. He couldn't escape it. He could hear her mocking voice in his head, replaying the moment over and over again. She had done exactly what he had feared. She had turned the tables on him. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the thief. But deep down, Luke knew something she didn't. This wasn't over. Not yet. The guilt of what he'd done gnawed at him, but so did the feeling that he hadn't reached the end of this story. There was more to come. The game had changed, and now he had to decide what he was willing to do next. The consequences were just beginning to unfold. The days that followed Luke's failed attempt to retrieve his phone were like a slow burn. He couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a situation that had spiraled out of his control. He had made his move, and it had backfired. Every time he saw Olivia, he felt a mixture of shame and anger bubbling beneath the surface, and she seemed to revel in the power she had over him. The humiliation from that day in the hallway lingered, especially as he watched Olivia walk through school with a sense of entitlement that made his skin crawl. She didn't care about him. She didn't even think twice about what she'd done. But to Luke, this wasn't just about the phone anymore. This was about his pride, his dignity, and the way he'd allowed her to make him feel small for so long. Olivia wasn't just the popular girl anymore. She was a symbol of everything Luke resented about the world. The divide between them felt like a chasm, impossible to bridge. His resentment grew each time he saw her, and it burned with the realization that there was no way to get her to understand how much this all meant to him. She would never see it. He was just another nameless face to her, someone who existed in her world, but didn't really matter. One Friday afternoon, the school bell rang, signaling the end of classes for the day. Luke gathered his things, ready to leave. He wasn't in the mood to hang around, not with the events of the past week still weighing heavily on his mind. He was walking out the door when something caught his eye, a figure standing just outside the school gates. It was Olivia, standing alone, her usual crowd nowhere in sight. She looked different, somehow. There was no arrogance in her posture, no confident air that usually radiated from her. In fact, she looked vulnerable. Luke hesitated, uncertain whether to approach her or just keep walking. His instinct told him to turn away, to keep his distance, but something inside him made him stop. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the small, distant part of him that still wanted to believe she wasn't as bad as she seemed. Or maybe it was just the thought that, for the first time, she might actually have something to say that wasn't dripping with condescension. Luke. Her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. He looked up, surprised to find her looking at him with a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. It was almost as though she didn't know how to talk to him, like she wasn't sure if he was still angry or if he'd just ignored her. The same Olivia who had once commanded a room now seemed to be at a loss for words. "I need to talk to you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It was so unlike her that it took Luke a moment to process what was happening. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. What did she want now? To rub her victory in his face again? To taunt him? He couldn't figure it out. He took a cautious step forward, crossing his arms in front of him. "What do you want?" I never meant for things to get this far," Olivia said, her words coming out slowly, as though she were carefully choosing each one. "I didn't mean to take your phone. I didn't think it would matter that much to you." Luke blinked in surprise. Was she apologizing? Was this some sort of joke? He couldn't tell if she was being sincere, but something in her tone made him stop and listen. Olivia continued, her voice lower now. "You don't understand. My life isn't perfect. I know it probably looks that way from the outside, but it's not. I've been struggling with everything. My dad's always pushing me to be something I'm not, to be perfect. He doesn't care about me, just what I can do for him. And everything is just pressure, constant pressure." Luke didn't know how to respond. He'd always seen Olivia as the girl who had everything, the one who didn't have to work for anything because it was just handed to her. The idea that she was struggling felt so foreign to him that it didn't seem real. But there was something in her eyes, something raw and vulnerable, that made him pause. Maybe he had misjudged her. Maybe this wasn't just a matter of privilege and entitlement. Maybe there was more to it than that. I didn't know," Luke said quietly, not sure what else to say. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Olivia sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I know I shouldn't have taken your phone. But at the time, I just wanted something that felt like mine. something that wasn't about being perfect, something that felt real. She looked at him, her gaze earnest. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know the truth." Luke didn't know what to think. This wasn't the Olivia he had known, the girl who had always seemed so untouchable. This was a different side of her, one he had never seen before. He didn't know if it was enough to justify what she had done, but in that moment, he understood something. Olivia's actions weren't just about him. They were about her. They were about the pressure she had been under, the expectations that had been placed on her shoulders, and the way she had tried to cope with it all. "I get it," Luke said finally, the words coming more easily now. "I still don't think it was right, but I get it." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The sounds of students laughing and chatting as they left for the day filled the silence, but it felt different now, less oppressive. It was as if, for the first time, Olivia and Luke were seeing each other as real people, not just symbols of what they represented to one another. "You still have my phone," Luke said, breaking the silence. Olivia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll get it back to you," she said quietly, her expression now sincere. "I'm sorry it had to go this way." Luke nodded, and for the first time in days, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, whether things between him and Olivia would ever be the same. But for now, he felt like a chapter had ended. Not a perfect ending, but a beginning. Olivia turned to leave, but Luke stopped her. "Hey, one more thing," he said. She turned around, raising an eyebrow. "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You don't have to be perfect. Nobody does." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. And then, surprisingly, she smiled. It was small, but it was real. "Thanks, Luke," she said before walking away. As Luke watched her disappear into the crowd, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment when everything had truly shifted. He didn't know what would come next, but he realized one thing. It was no longer just about a stolen phone. It was about understanding, about seeing beyond the surface. And in that moment, Luke understood that people weren't defined by their mistakes. They were defined by what they did afterward. The days following the return of his phone were a strange mix of relief and introspection for Luke. He had hoped that once the issue was resolved, he could move on. But the reality wasn't so simple. Something had shifted, but it wasn't just about the phone anymore. It was about everything that had led up to this point. The more he thought about the past few weeks, the more he realized how much this experience had changed him. Olivia's apology, though brief and simple, had left a lasting impact. It was one thing for someone to apologize, but it was something else entirely when they revealed the vulnerability behind their actions. As the days passed, Luke found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He had been so focused on getting the phone back, on seeking some kind of justice, that he hadn't fully considered the underlying issues that had led to this confrontation. Olivia, in her own way, had been struggling too. She wasn't just a rich, entitled girl living in a world of privilege. She was a person with her own battles, her own fears, her own insecurities. And Luke realized that, in a way, they were both victims of the same system, one that placed impossible expectations on people like Olivia, and one that made people like him feel invisible. The next Monday, things began to feel almost normal again. The tension that had once filled the hallways seemed to have dissipated, and people were moving through their routines with less judgment. Olivia was still Olivia, but there was something more subdued about her now. She no longer walked through the hallways with that air of superiority. She was quieter, more thoughtful, and for the first time, Luke saw her not as a symbol of everything he resented, but as a person who had made mistakes, just like everyone else. Despite the unspoken understanding between them, things weren't perfect. Luke was still hesitant around Olivia. He wasn't sure how to interact with her now that the lines between them had blurred. In some ways, he had learned to forgive her, but in others, he still found it hard to let go of the past. The school had a way of quickly moving on, But Luke realized he wasn't quite ready to do that yet. He needed time. The experience had shown him that closure wasn't something that could be rushed. Sometimes it took weeks, months, or even years for people to truly process what had happened and how it had changed them. As time passed, however, something unexpected started to happen. Luke began to notice how people in his school started looking at him differently. He wasn't sure if it was because of the whole situation with Olivia or if something else was going on, but there was a subtle shift in the way he was perceived. It wasn't as though he was suddenly the center of attention, but there was a newfound respect that seemed to be growing. It wasn't just about the fact that he had stood up for himself in a difficult situation, but something deeper. Luke had gained confidence in ways he hadn't expected. He began to see his place in the world more clearly, no longer defined by his possessions or the status of others, but by his actions, his integrity, and his ability to stay true to himself, even when it felt like the world was pushing against him. The social dynamics in school had always been rigid, with certain groups and cliques that seemed impossible to break into. But Luke, who had once been the quiet, overlooked kid, found himself engaging with people he had never expected to connect with. He began to realize that there were more people than he had realized who felt like outsiders, who struggled with their own battles, but never had the chance to voice them. They weren't all like Olivia, with wealth and privilege to mask their vulnerabilities. Many of them were like him, facing their own struggles, hidden beneath the surface. The unexpected twist came when Luke's best friend, Eli, pulled him aside one afternoon after school. "You know," Eli started, his voice sounding more serious than usual, "I've been thinking about what happened with Olivia." Luke gave him a questioning look. "And I think you handled it way better than I ever could have." Luke smiled a little, but it wasn't the easy, confident smile he'd used to put on a facade. It was a genuine smile, the kind that came with understanding. "I don't know about that," he said. "I mean, I messed up too. I did things I regret." "Yeah, but you didn't just go and make everything worse. You found a way to make things right without destroying her, or yourself," Eli said, pausing to let his words sink in. "A lot of people wouldn't have done that." Luke thought about Eli's words long after they parted ways. He didn't have all the answers, and he certainly wasn't perfect, but in that moment, he understood what Eli was trying to say. Sometimes, strength wasn't about fighting back. It was about letting go of the anger that kept you trapped in a cycle of resentment. It was about being able to stand up for yourself without hurting others in the process. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't come with instant rewards, but it was the only way forward. By the end of the semester, something remarkable had occurred. The school, which had once felt like a battle zone where everyone was trying to outdo each other, had softened. It wasn't perfect, but it had become a place where people weren't defined by their wealth or their status, but by their actions. The once rigid lines between cliques began to blur, and Luke found himself being treated with a newfound respect. Olivia, too, had changed in her own way. She wasn't the same girl who had mocked him for his outdated phone. She wasn't perfect, but she had begun to understand the weight of her actions and the impact they had on others. It wasn't just about the phone anymore. It wasn't about whether Olivia had apologized or whether Luke had gotten revenge. It was about what they had learned from each other and from the experience. They had both been forced to confront their own vulnerabilities, and in doing so, they had both grown. Luke realized that the greatest gift he could give himself was the freedom to let go of resentment and to see people for who they truly were. Flawed, yes, but also capable of change. As the year came to an end, Luke stood in the hallway, watching the students around him. He had come a long way. The challenges he had faced, the anger he had fought, and the lessons he had learned all pointed to one thing. Sometimes, the most unexpected people teach us the most important lessons about who we are. He wasn't just the kid who had his phone stolen anymore. He was someone who had found his voice, who had learned to stand tall in a world that often tried to knock him down. And in that moment, he realized that no matter what came next, he was ready to face it, because he was no longer defined by what others thought of him. He was defined by his own actions, his own strength, and his ability to move forward, no matter how hard it seemed. The end of the school year arrived faster than Luke had anticipated. As summer break loomed on the horizon, he felt a mix of emotions. There was a sense of accomplishment, of course, but also a lingering unease. He had changed over the course of the past few months, grown in ways he hadn't expected. But there was still a nagging feeling that everything wasn't quite settled. It wasn't just about Olivia anymore, nor the phone, nor even the things that had once seemed so important. It was about the person he had become in the process, and whether he had truly learned the lessons he had been taught, both through the events that unfolded and the introspection that followed. Olivia, for her part, had kept her distance over the last few weeks. There was no animosity between them, no tension, but neither had they gone back to being anything close to friends. Their interactions had shifted from the awkward exchanges of the past to something that felt more like mutual recognition. They no longer exchanged heated words or empty pleasantries. Instead, they passed each other in the halls with a quiet acknowledgement. Olivia had her own struggles to contend with, and Luke had his. They had both learned something about the world, and about themselves, through their collision. But there was no need for further confrontation. The damage had been done, but so had the healing. As the days drifted toward the end of the school year, Luke found himself growing more and more comfortable with the changes he had made. He wasn't the same person who had walked into school months ago, feeling invisible and irrelevant. Now, there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. His head was held just a little higher, his back straighter. He didn't feel like he needed to shrink anymore, or to hide in the shadows. For the first time, Luke was able to see himself not just as someone who had survived the ups and downs of high school, but as someone who had actively shaped his own story. The real test, however, came just before the final bell rang for summer vacation. It was a typical afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows across the school grounds as students packed their bags and got ready to leave. Luke was standing by his locker, collecting his things, when he saw Olivia approaching. She wasn't with her usual group of friends, and there was no one else around. She was alone, just as he had been the first time they spoke outside the cafeteria. This time, there was no tension between them, no urgency. It was just two people standing in a hallway, the weight of everything that had happened between them hanging in the air. "Luke," Olivia said, her voice sounding more earnest than he had ever heard it. She paused for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I just wanted to say, thank you for not making things worse. I know I've caused you a lot of trouble, and I didn't realize how much I was hurting you at the time. But you didn't take it out on me. You just handled it differently. And I think you're a better person for it." Luke didn't know how to respond right away. He had spent so much time resenting Olivia, and now here she was, admitting her mistakes. She was still Olivia, the girl who had stolen his phone, the one who had taunted him. But she was also someone who had grown, just like he had. She had made amends in her own way, and Luke realized, for the first time, that he didn't need to carry the anger anymore. "Thanks," Luke said, his voice steady but full of a quiet gratitude he hadn't expected to feel. "I appreciate it. I guess we both learned something through all of this, huh?" Olivia nodded slowly, a small, understanding smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Yeah, I guess we did." They stood in silence for a moment, and it wasn't uncomfortable. There was no bitterness between them, no unfinished business. It was as though the events that had defined their interactions for so long had finally come full circle, and there was no need for further explanation. They had both learned something valuable, something about forgiveness, about standing up for yourself, and about letting go of what no longer served them. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was enough. As they parted ways, Luke felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just about the phone or Olivia, or even the social dynamics that had once ruled his life. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental. He had spent so much of his life trying to fit into a world that didn't always make sense, trying to prove that he belonged. But now, for the first time, he understood that belonging wasn't about trying to fit in. It was about accepting yourself for who you were, flaws and all, and being comfortable in your own skin. The summer stretched out before him like an open road, full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, Luke was eager to see where it would take him. The uncertainty that had once clouded his future was now replaced by a quiet excitement. He had faced his fears, his doubts, and the frustrations that had once held him back. And through it all, he had learned one of life's most important lessons. It wasn't about the things you lost or the things you gained. It was about how you responded to the challenges along the way, and the strength you found in the process. As Luke walked out of the school, stepping into the bright sunlight, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The future was uncertain, of course, but he was no longer afraid of it. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the power to shape his own story. And in the end, that was all that mattered.